Horror fans are passionate, opinionated, and sometimes downright territorial about what they love. The genre is filled with classics that shaped our nightmares, cult favorites that demand devotion, and new releases that spark heated debates. But today, I am throwing caution to the wind and laying out some of my personal horror hot takes. Some mild, some scorching, and some that just might get me exiled from the horror community. Some of these opinions will be easy to agree with, while others might make you want to hunt me down like I'm the final girl in a slasher movie. Either way, I'm here to defend them, so get your angry comments ready and let's dive into some of my horror hot takes. Starting off pretty mild on the Scoville scale of horror hot takes, this is sort of like the bell pepper of hot takes, but I promise the list gets spicier as it goes on. I'm probably going to piss some people off with this list, but the first entry is one that I think a lot of people will probably agree with. Anyway, number one is that the remake can be better than the original. Horror cinema has a long and storied history, starting with the French short film The House of the Devil, released in 1896. Though only 3 minutes long, it's often cited as the first horror film. Though some people debate this because it's not a feature-length film and point instead to the later The Student of Prague from 1913, which has a runtime of an hour and 25 minutes. Though to be fair, The House of the Devil's 3-minute runtime was considered ambitious at the time it was made. The reason that I bring this up is because it was not only the first ever horror film, but it was also the first horror film to be remade, with the remake, The Haunted Castle, being released in 1897, just 1 year later. And the reason that it was remade was because the filmmaker, Georges Méliès, wanted to improve upon the special effects. The Haunted Castle was a shorter film with a runtime of just 45 seconds, but it was also in color, using a technique of hand coloring to help the character stand out from the painted backdrop and distract the eye from the editing tricks that were used. So the first ever remake was made in 1897. Some people act like remakes are a modern phenomenon, but they're not. Remakes have been a part of filmmaking history almost since its inception, driven by a desire to revisit and refine ideas as technology and storytelling techniques evolve. Not only have they existed nearly as long as film, but they've always been extremely prevalent. Like I said before, the first remake of a horror film came out in 1897. That's almost 130 years ago. Obviously, there's a huge difference between a good remake and a bad one, but a lot of people tend to generalize remakes as being mostly bad, and I don't necessarily agree with this sentiment. While there are a lot of remakes that are created just to generate a profit off an existing IP, or even occasionally in order for a studio to retain the rights to a certain IP, there are also a lot of remakes that are created with the same spirit of reinvention that led Méliès to remake The House of the Devil, or to build on ideas and explore different approaches to a particular narrative. Probably the best example of this is, of course, John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. While Howard Hughes' 1951 film The Thing from Another World laid the groundwork with its Cold War-era allegory and claustrophobic setting, Carpenter's version embraced a darker, more visceral vision of John W. Campbell Jr.'s novella, Who Goes There?, and elevated the concept into something truly extraordinary. At its core, Carpenter's The Thing thrives on paranoia and isolation. Set in an Antarctic research station, the film amplifies tension by trapping the characters in an environment as harsh as the alien threat itself. This isolation raises the stakes and mirrors the crew's psychological torment as they struggle to determine who among them is the thing. Carpenter masterfully builds tension through pacing, cinematography, and Ennio Morricone's minimalist score. The film's long, eerie shots of the frozen wasteland emphasize the team's entrapment, while the soundtrack's rhythmic, heartbeat-like tones heighten the growing fear and mistrust. But what truly sets The Thing apart is Rob Bottin's groundbreaking practical effects. The alien's ability to imitate and grotesquely transform its victims results in some of horror's most visceral and unforgettable sequences. Decades later, these effects remain unparalleled, blending art and technology to create creatures that are both horrifying and mesmerizing. Bottin captures the alien's ever-changing, unknowable nature, making it all the more terrifying. While The Thing from Another World reflects Cold War anxieties, Carpenter's The Thing taps into a more universal fear, the unknown and the betrayal of trust. More than just a remake, it redefined the genre and cemented itself as one of the greatest horror films of all time. Another great example is David Cronenberg's 1986 film The Fly, which reimagines the 1958 original, replacing its quirky sci-fi premise with emotional depth, visceral horror, and poignant tragedy. Jeff Goldblum delivers one of horror's greatest performances as Seth Brundle, a brilliant scientist whose experiment leads to a slow, horrifying transformation. Unlike the original straightforward cautionary tale about scientific hubris, Cronenberg's version prioritizes the human element, making Brundle's descent into monstrosity both heartbreaking and terrifying. Goldblum masterfully balances Brundle's initial charm with his eventual desperation, making his fate all the more tragic. The film excels at blending terror and empathy. Brundle's mutation, brought to life by Chris Wallace's Oscar-winning practical effects, unfolds in excruciating detail. Unlike the 1958 version's external transformation, Cronenberg's horror is deeply intimate, depicting Brundle's gradual, internal metamorphosis into the grotesque Brundlefly. Gina Davis's performance as Veronica Waif adds emotional weight as her love for Brundle makes his transformation even more devastating. Her anguish mirrors the audience's, grounding the film's body horror in genuine human pain. Beyond its grotesque visuals, The Fly serves as an allegory for disease and decay, reflecting fears of terminal illness and the loss of identity, making it one of the most haunting and deeply affecting horror films ever made. Now, with my next hot take, we're starting to get a little hotter. I think a lot of people might disagree with this. I think a lot of people will also agree with it, though, and it's that the Blair Witch Project is boring. The Blair Witch Project is considered a landmark in horror cinema, responsible for popularizing the found footage subgenre. Its marketing campaign, which blurred the lines between fiction and reality, was revolutionary, creating a sense of mystique and fear that captivated audiences. However, when separated from this groundbreaking marketing and cultural context, the film itself struggles to deliver scares and often feels tedious, relying more on implication than actual terror. The premise is simple. 3 filmmakers venture into the woods to document the legend of the Blair Witch, only to find themselves lost and terrorized by an unseen force. While this setup is intriguing, the execution leans heavily on minimalism, arguably too heavily. Much of the film consists of shaky cam footage of the group wandering through the woods, arguing and slowly unraveling. While this is intended to build tension and immerse viewers in the character's plight, the lack of action or concrete scares often make it feel repetitive and, frankly, dull. For many, the film's horror hinges on its climax, the final scene in an abandoned house where Heather finds Mike standing in a corner before the screen cuts to black. While this moment's meant to be chilling in its ambiguity, it's actually pretty anticlimactic, and the hour and a half leading up to it offer little payoff for the time invested. The scares are mostly auditory, branches snapping, distant cackling, and the occasional pile of rocks or stick figures, presumably left by the unseen antagonist. It's frankly underwhelming. And the film rarely escalates its sense of danger in any satisfying way. Part of the problem lies in the characters. While their descent into panic and paranoia feels authentic, the constant bickering and lack of development makes it difficult to connect with them emotionally. Without a deeper investment in their fate, the audience is left to endure their arguments rather than ever truly fearing for their lives. The film's decision to forego any tangible appearance of the Blair Witch herself, while effective in maintaining mystery, also kind of feels as though we've been cheated out of a proper confrontation or resolution. It's also worth noting that a lot of the impact of the Blair Witch Project was tied to its innovative marketing campaign, which created a sense of real-world fear that the film alone struggles to sustain. The viral strategy, including fake news stories, missing person posters, a convincing website, and even a fake documentary that aired on a sci-fi channel, led many to believe that the events depicted were real. Once the veil of reality was lifted, much of the terror dissipated, leaving behind a film that just doesn't hold up. The Blair Witch Project is more interesting as a cultural artifact than as a piece of horror cinema, leaving it stuck in a liminal space between groundbreaking marketing innovation and an underwhelming viewing experience. My next horror hot take is that the 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre was not a good remake. I mentioned before that I think remakes can be terrific films in their own right, and that some remakes even surpass the original. However, I do not think the 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake is one of these films. Horror thrives on its ability to unsettle, to crawl under the skin, and to linger long after the credits roll, festering like a persistent boil. Few films have captured this sensation as effectively as Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a raw, visceral masterpiece that remains a landmark in both horror and independent filmmaking. When the 2003 remake emerged, it sought to capitalize on the original's legacy, reimagining it for a new generation. Despite its commercial success and being lauded by some as a superior remake, often alongside films like The Fly and The Thing, however, I completely disagree with this sentiment. Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a masterclass in tension and terror. Shot on a shoestring budget, the film's constraints work to its advantage, creating an almost documentary-like realism that pulls the audience deeper into its world. It is a relentless descent into madness where the absence of overt gore only enhances its impact, forcing viewers to use their imagination to fill in the grisly gaps. This restraint is key to the film's power, making what's implied far more terrifying than what's actually shown. At the heart of the original is its atmosphere. The oppressive Texas heat is almost suffocating, its weight adding to the ever-building tension. Every detail, the shrieking metal, the hum of the chainsaw, the grainy cinematography, serves to immerse viewers in a world that feels both lived in and decayed, amplifying the sense of unnerving authenticity. The environment itself is as much a character as the protagonists, deepening the film's sense of dread. The chaos at the center of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is embodied by the Sawyer family, a grotesque family unit that defies all traditional notions of normalcy. Leatherface, the film's iconic antagonist, is less a villain with clear motives and more a force of nature, an embodiment of randomness and violence. There is no backstory, no explanation, no moral lesson, just pure, unrelenting terror. In stark contrast, the 2003 remake replaces the raw chaos of the original with a polished, studio-driven aesthetic. While it may have made the film more accessible to mainstream audiences, it dilutes the terror that made the original so groundbreaking. One of the remake's major missteps is its over-reliance on gore and shock value. While violence absolutely has its place in horror, this film prioritizes it over atmosphere and subtlety. The result is a film that, despite its graphic imagery, feels superficial. What once was left to the imagination is now laid bare, stripping the horror of its lingering, haunting power. In fact, seeing more violence actually diminishes its impact. The remake also falters by over-explaining its narrative. Unlike the original, which thrives on ambiguity, the remake attempts to humanize Leatherface by offering a backstory. While this might seem like an effort to deepen the character, it ultimately undermines his mystique. Horror is, at its most effective, when it allows the unknown to fester, letting fear grow in the absence of explanation. The characters in the remake, too, suffer from being reduced to archetypes. While the original's protagonists, though not deeply developed, felt like real people thrust into a nightmare, the remake's cast are mere victims, designed solely to meet grisly ends. This lack of authenticity extends to the Sawyer family, renamed the Hewitts in the remake, who feel more like caricatures than the terrifying, unhinged figures of the original. The 1974 Texas Chainsaw Massacre emerged at a time of societal upheaval, reflecting the disillusionment of the 1970s. The Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, and a pervasive sense of distrust in authority informed its nihilistic tone. The film tapped into the anxieties of the era, presenting a world where traditional notions of safety and morality had eroded. The 2003 remake, however, is the product of the early 2000s remake and reboot trend, driven more by studios looking to cash in on established properties than by any desire for innovation. While it boasts slick production values and a more modern sensibility, it lacks the cultural resonance and raw inventiveness of its predecessor. The original, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, endures because it's uncompromising, boundary-pushing, and deeply unsettling. It's a film that doesn't just entertain, it shakes the viewer to their core. The 2003 remake, while not devoid of merit, fails to capture what made the original so groundbreaking. By prioritizing gore over atmosphere, explanation over ambiguity, and polish over grit, it transforms a revolutionary piece of cinema into a forgettable exercise in genre filmmaking. Horror, at its best, should disturb, provoke, and challenge its audience. Tobe Hooper understood this in 1974. Marcus Nispel in 2003 did not. My next horror hot take is another one that I think will probably upset a lot of people. I hate the Conjuring series. The Conjuring series frustrates me because it elevates Ed and Lorraine Warren to heroic, almost saintly figures, presenting them as selfless defenders against evil when the reality of their actions is far more troubling. The films craft a revisionist narrative that erases the Warrens' questionable behaviors, constructing a mythological version of their lives that distorts the truth. In reality, the Warrens were notorious for sensationalizing paranormal events and exploiting vulnerable families for personal fame and financial gain. Many of their most famous cases, including the Amityville Horror, have since been debunked or exposed as outright hoaxes. Rather than offering genuine help, the Warrens often inserted themselves into crises where families were desperate for assistance. Whether because they believed they were experiencing genuine paranormal activity or because of deeper psychological and financial struggles. Instead of providing aid, they manipulated these situations, using them to enhance their own reputations and careers, often at the expense of the families involved. Their claims were rarely substantiated by verifiable evidence, and many critics, including former colleagues, have accused them of being outright frauds. What makes this so unsettling is how the Conjuring films completely ignore these exploitative aspects, instead presenting the Warrens as loving, altruistic protectors, rather than confronting the darker, more problematic reality of who they were. The movies perpetuate a sanitized, feel-good version of their story. This approach does a disservice to both the families the Warrens manipulated and to audiences. What could have been a complex narrative about belief, skepticism, and ethics is instead reduced to a shallow exercise in hero worship. My next horror hot take is that Hereditary is mid as fuck. Hereditary is often heralded as a modern horror masterpiece, but beneath its polished surface, it struggles to maintain substance beyond a few standout moments. The film's most memorable and shocking moment, the devastating mid-film incident, delivers a gut punch that lingers long after it happens, and the immediate fallout is masterfully handled, brimming with suffocating grief and familial tension. It's this sequence, along with Toni Collette's powerhouse performance, that elevates the film in the eyes of many. Collette's raw, emotionally charged portrayal of a mother unraveling under the weight of tragedy is undeniably mesmerizing. Her ability to oscillate between anguish, rage, and despair gives the story much of its emotional heft, making her performance the film's greatest strength. However, beyond these elements, the film falters. The pacing becomes uneven as it shifts gears from a tense family drama to a supernatural horror tale. And while the intricate set design and visual motifs suggest depth, much of it feels hollow or overly reliant on symbolism for its own sake. The climax in particular is where the film completely unravels. What begins as unsettling and mysterious descends into absurdity, with a sequence so over the top that it feels more laughable than frightening. The tonal shift at the end undoes much of the dread that had been so carefully cultivated earlier in the film, leaving viewers with an experience that feels disjointed and inconsistent. Hereditary is undeniably a film with flashes of brilliance, but its reputation as a modern horror classic rely heavily on the most shocking scene and the exceptional work of Toni Collette. Stripped of those elements, what's left is a film that doesn't live up to the hype. I don't even really feel like this next one is a hot take, but I've been told that it is, and so I put it on this list, and it's that Black Christmas is better than Halloween. Black Christmas sort of lives in the shadow of Halloween when discussing the birth of the modern slasher genre. But I really think that it deserves more recognition as the superior film. Not only did it establish many of the tropes that would later go on to define the genre, it also delivered a far more atmospheric and unsettling experience than its more famous successor. While Halloween thrives on its clean, methodical approach to suspense, Black Christmas revels in a grim, chaotic sense of dread. One of the key ways that Black Christmas distinguishes itself is through its willingness to embrace ambiguity and the unknown. The film's villain, Billy, remains an enigma throughout. His motives are never explained and his face is never fully shown. His incoherent, chilling phone calls filled with whispers, screams, and disturbing phrases add a deeply unnerving psychological element to the terror. This contrasts with Halloween's Michael Myers, who, while enigmatic in his own right, becomes a more straightforward embodiment of evil. Billy's incomprehensible madness feels raw and unpredictable, making him a far more disturbing presence. Black Christmas also broke ground by establishing many of the slasher genre's enduring tropes years before Halloween codified them. The concept of a killer stalking and picking off a group of young women one by one, Black Christmas did it first. The menacing phone calls, Black Christmas perfected them. The final girl archetype, Jess, played by Olivia Hussey, embodied it, not through physical prowess, but through resilience, intelligence, and emotional depth. Even the now iconic killer is inside the house twist, which has since become a horror cliche, was masterfully executed here. Where Halloween emphasizes tension through precision and simplicity, Black Christmas immerses viewers in an oppressive, foreboding atmosphere. Director Bob Clark uses long, creeping camera movements and dimly lit claustrophobic interiors to create a sense of unease. The sorority house, far from being a safe haven, becomes a labyrinth of shadows and hidden horrors. Clark's use of sound is equally haunting, with the eerie piano score and Billy's deranged mutterings creating an auditory landscape as unsettling as the visuals. While John Carpenter's iconic score for Halloween is undeniably brilliant, Black Christmas achieves its terror without relying on repetitive musical cues, opting instead for an organic, unpredictable soundscape. Thematically, Black Christmas is also more layered than Halloween. The film subtly explores issues such as gender dynamics, bodily autonomy, and societal expectations, particularly through Jess's subplot involving her unplanned pregnancy and her decision to prioritize her own goals over her boyfriend's wishes. This level of nuance gives the character a depth rarely seen in slasher films, making their fates feel more impactful. In contrast, Halloween, while masterful in its execution, focuses more narrowly on its central conflict of good versus evil, embodied by Laurie Strode and Michael Myers. And finally, Black Christmas's ending stands out as one of the most haunting in horror history, where Halloween concludes with Michael's disappearance, signaling his continued threat. Black Christmas leaves viewers with an even more chilling ambiguity. The final shot lingers on the sorority house, its halls still echoing with dread as the phone begins to ring yet again. There's no closure, no catharsis, just the cold, stark realization that the nightmare isn't over. It's a bleak, uncompromising finale that stays with you, refusing to let go. While Halloween undoubtedly deserves its place as a landmark in horror cinema, Black Christmas laid the groundwork for much of that success. It pushed boundaries, established tropes, and delivered an atmospheric horror experience that feels raw and timeless. For those willing to venture beyond the well-trodden paths of Halloween's Haddonfield, Black Christmas offers a darker, more unsettling journey into the heart of slasher terror. All right, so those were some of my horror hot takes. I probably made some people mad with some of these. Maybe you agree with me. Maybe I convinced you of my opinions of some of these horror movies. Either way, let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, could you please hit the like button? You can also subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be updated whenever I upload a new video. And until next time, keep on creeping on.